This Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny says he's going on a hunger strike to protest his treatment in prison. In a statement posted on Instagram Wednesday, Navalny says he's being refused medicine to treat back and leg pain, and prison officials won't let him see his doctor. The outspoken critic of Vladimir Putin was sentenced to 2.5 years in prison in February after a 5-month stay in Germany to recover from suspected poisoning. He was arrested on a 2014 embezzlement charge, which he says was made up. This sparked a series of protests across Russia, during which more than 10,000 people were detained. Joining us now, columnist and associate editor for The Washington Post, David Ignatius, and correspondent for GQ magazine, Julia Ioffe. It's good to have you both. David, I'd like to ask you, just what is the U.S. position on Navalny? And as his imprisonment continues, the time that he is being held continues, and as these stories come out about his condition deteriorating, how is he a stake in the U.S.-Russian relationship? And should more be done, given what he represents?
Navalny, Mika, has become a symbol of the growing protest in Russia against President Vladimir Putin. The United States has called for Navalny's release, has criticized the prosecution of him. He's not simply being denied medicine in this prison. He's being awakened, he says, every hour, deprived of sleep in something that sounds almost like torture. The U.S. is joined by European countries. Chancellor Merkel of Germany and French President Emmanuel Macron called Putin on Tuesday to protest the treatment of Navalny and to raise this issue. We just have to remember what an extraordinarily courageous man this is. Back in August, he was poisoned in Russia. It was later learned that he was poisoned with a deadly nerve agent, Novichok, taken to Germany, diagnosed, and then he had the guts to go back to Russia. He was arrested when he got to the airport and then released a scathing attack on Putin that was seen across Russia by tens of millions of people, triggering these protest movements when he was arrested. In 109 Russian cities, there were people out in the streets protesting. There's concern by Putin that the protests will resume. 360,000 Russians have signed up to say that they want to be part of new protests. So I think the Russians are getting worried, and the U.S. is concerned that Putin, feeling defensive, may take steps to distract Russians from these problems that could make the situation in that part of the world even more dangerous.
So, Julia, following directly the Navalny story, can you update us on his condition, what is happening to him? What are his supporters saying?
Well, his supporters and his wife are saying in their social media posts that, you guys all know Navalny, he's a jokester, he is an optimist, he will not complain until things are really, really dire. And the fact that he is not just complaining, which he started to do last week, and demanding medical help, but the fact that he is going on hunger strike shows how dire the situation is, because he wouldn't do something like this unless things were really bad. He is saying he can't feel his right leg and his left leg is starting to go. He's having sharp pains in his back. People don't know if this is, the condition of just like a herniated disc, or if they're using some nerve agent on him, or if these are the consequences or the fallout of the poisoning back in August. He has only been seen by prison doctors. They're not telling him the results of an MRI. They're not giving him anything other than ibuprofen. And as David said, he's also being deprived of sleep, which they believe constitutes torture. And I think they're really worried. They're worried that he won't make it through this prison sentence, that he is totally at the mercy of Vladimir Putin and his government, and that now that they have him in their grasp, they won't let him out alive.
Julia, what's the state of the protest movement that Navalny, in part or largely, has sparked in Russia? We know that people have been rounded up and arrested, obviously, by the thousands by the Putin regime. But we also know that there are plans for a protest of perhaps as many as 500,000 people in the streets of Moscow and across Russia in support of Navalny. So how is that movement moving forward?
I think right now it's lying in wait for some kind of command from Navalny's team about what they should do next. I think there's huge potential there, but the Kremlin was clearly hoping to decapitate this movement by taking Navalny out of the game for at least the next 2.5 years. People also expect that they're going to find new things to tack on to this prison sentence so that it's not just 2.5 years, but perhaps even longer, and that taking him out of the game like this, where he can't, appear on his YouTube channel and be seen by tens of millions of Russians, giving the command to go out into the street, that will kind of tamp things down. I think what's also really important to remember when we think about, things that, to your prior question, Mika, about what the U.S. can do in this situation. The problem is that at this point, the Kremlin has clearly become so vehement and radicalized in its opposition to Navalny. They see it, people are comparing, I'm seeing social media posts comparing what's happening now to what happened 8 or 9 or 10 years ago when Navalny was just kind of coming to the fore as the protest leader, and how those were so-called vegetarian times. I think now things have entered a different phase where people in the Kremlin, people who are Kremlin adjacent, including those riot police who beat up women and young people in the streets of Moscow, see it as a fight, an existential fight, that it's either us or them. And so therefore, when the U.S. thinks about implementing sanctions, it's like, you're dealing with Bashar al-Assad in Syria. They don't care about sanctions if they're worried about their very existence.
And broadening out, David Ignatius, you've written this week about the overall relationship with Russia and China and sort of a cyber world order. Tell us about that.
Well, Mika, I think this is a time of tension between the U.S. and China and Russia both. We have a new administration that's trying to show that it's going to take a tougher, more consistent line with both countries. I noted in my piece earlier this week that Russia, largely out of sight, is trying to capture control of the rule-writing process for cyberspace. Amazing as that is, the people who hack all of our systems, who hack our elections, want to be the cops, in effect, setting the rules for the future. They're trying to write a treaty at the UN to control cyberspace. I think this administration is trying to push back, to be clearer and firmer. One sign, it's hard to interpret exactly what it means, is the call that was made yesterday by General Mark Milley, our chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, to his Russian counterpart, General Gerasimov. This is often something that happens in times of rising tension. So we'll see going forward, but I think people need to put on their seatbelts for a period of some testing of Russia and the United States. The fact that Putin is really backed up, I think he's rattled by Navalny, adds another factor to this situation that's unusual and has people watching carefully.
David Ignatius and Julia Ioffe, thank you both very much for coming on today.
Hey, thanks so much for watching our YouTube channel. You can follow up on today's top stories and breaking news, or catch up on your favorite MSNBC shows all in one place. Download the NBC News app today.